I'm Billy Hollowell, host of CBN's new documentary investigating the supernatural Miracles. Now, the interview that you're about to watch details an incredible miracle story, but I want to briefly talk about our film, which tells different stories that will deeply challenge you, inspire you, and get you thinking deeper about evidence for the supernatural. Before we air today's interview, please check out this 60-second trailer for investigating the supernatural Miracles. You can head on over to cbn.com/supernatural to watch the film. Here's the trailer.
I got out of my patrol car and I slipped.
I went from having a promising career as a neuroscientist to having a medical death sentence.
I said there was nothing else that we could do. There was no heartbeat.
Time of death, 8:05.
Are miracles real? Do they happen today? Let's investigate.
A lot of skeptics will say, well, miracles are impossible. Why? Because they violate the laws of nature. You can't violate the laws of nature.
People would pray for me, and sometimes it felt like this power that just zapped me.
When I woke up, she says, "Can you do anything that you didn't do before?" I looked at my hand that was clutched. I said, "Hand move."
He's dead. It's over. I said, shock him one more time.
Well, maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. Let's look at the evidence.
And here is today's interview, which we hope will deeply inspire you. So Cameron, you've got a crazy story, and I want to dive into this. We're going to talk about a bunch of things today, but your personal story, just getting to know you, has been really touching to me, and I want to get into that. We're also going to talk about your role at Great American Media and plenty more, but let's start with your cancer journey, because when I heard this story, I was blown away. Your family went through something really unimaginable, a 4-year battle with leukemia. Let's go back and let's start, take us through how your parents realized something wasn't right.
Yeah, I don't know how you could hear my story and my testimony and not believe that there is a God. So yeah, my journey starts when I was only 1 year old. Both of my parents were working for a pretty well-known lawyer in the conservative Christian space, and they were supposed to move to Virginia Beach with him that day. And I got sick with an ear infection in the hustle and bustle of moving. My mom took me to the doctor. She thought it was just a routine ear infection. I had been getting them a lot lately. We showed up to the doctor. He gives us antibiotics. Everything is kind of normal. He wasn't concerned. And as we were about to leave, my mom stopped him and said, actually, on the way over here, the Lord spoke to me and told me that something is seriously wrong and that we need to go to the hospital, which is just a wild thing to say to a doctor. But thankfully, the doctor was a Christian, and he said, who am I to really argue with the Lord? So we can send you to the hospital. I don't know why I'm doing that, but let's do it. So they called an ambulance. We go to the hospital. My parents recall that in the ambulance, I was just sitting up completely fine, eating goldfish. And, all the emergency workers were like, why is he even going? So we pull up, and, my mom was just super confident that the Lord did speak to her and that this was an intentional decision. So they start to run pretty much every test imaginable, and they come back a few hours later and say, we're so sorry, 95% of your son's blood cells are leukemia. He probably won't make it through the night.
Okay. I have about 100 questions to kind of follow up here, but was that a common thing for your mom to get a prompting like that, from God? Was that something that happened a lot for her?
I think she would want me to say, yeah, of course, her and God speak to each other like that all the time. But I do think, she is a woman of very strong faith, and I credit so much of my faith to her. But I think this was a very unique moment, and probably would be unique for anyone to so clearly and decisively be able to quickly say, no, this was the Lord. Because I think a lot of us go through things, or we have feelings in our heart, and it's hard to really discern, is this just me thinking it's the Lord, or is this just really the Lord? So to be able to quickly discern that, I think, was huge. And I don't think it's a common occurrence at all.
No, I think you're right. And the other layer of that is, right, she gets this prompting, she feels that, and then you're on your way to a doctor. It's really hard, even if the doctor's a Christian. Right. I think it's hard for Christians to be like, hey, I felt this, God told me this, especially with a doctor. So there's this other layer of maybe even I could see people holding back and not actually saying like, hey, I felt this. So the fact that she was willing to do that and she just knew as a mother something wasn't right. And then for you to get to the hospital and to be almost 100% filled with leukemia. I mean,
Right.
and to the point where they're saying like, hey, you might not make it through the night. When your mom and your dad heard that, what were they feeling in those moments?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you can imagine, it's just a mix of utter disbelief and shock and starting to grieve and really just confusion of what to do. Um, and I think you kind of immediately go into a mode of, okay, let's figure out next steps. You kind of flip the switch into your brain of like, let's figure out how to fix this thing. So I think that's kind of the route that they went. So they just immediately began pretty intense chemotherapy. And,
And you were one, just to reiterate
yeah,
that, like you're a
yeah,
baby, okay,
yeah.
going through insane chemotherapy.
Yeah, and I just can't imagine being my parents in that situation. You wake up in the morning, you think you're moving to a new state and that everything's completely fine. And then that night to find out that your son might pass away at any moment, like nothing could test their faith quite like that. And, I'm sure we'll get to this later, but I said this earlier, but so much of my faith is I credit to them because I think most people in situations like that, it's very easy for them to turn against God, turn against each other. You hear stories all the time of people that used to be Christians, but then went through something like this and now don't believe in God, or divorces that come out of these things. So the fact that they relied on God through that and then came out on the other side stronger, their marriage is still very strong and that their faith is still very strong. I don't think that I would have the same faith that I have today had they not responded the way they did through that whole journey.
Yeah. And, so you're this whole time, I would imagine, like, even with faith, there's that fear, right? I mean, like, obviously, you're told might not survive through the night. You go on this 4-year journey of treatment, of insane, intense treatment. There's so many questions around that. How did they deal with, and I know you were super young, I know you guys have obviously talked a lot about it, but how did they deal with that navigation of the uncertainty for so long?
I think it's tough. I think community is incredibly important. I think that you just have to surround yourself with really good, solid Christian people. And I think that's what they did. We were very blessed to always have people either staying with us, taking care of my brother through all of this, because that was a whole nother element of it. And I think they just really sought to, understand from the Lord how they could be faithful through the journey, but also surrounding themselves with really good people that would uplift them in moments like this. I think there are times when you just simply can't do it on your own. And I'm sure through those 4 years, they experienced those times. So I also think, we have to credit a lot of this journey to the people that were in our lives during that moment that walked alongside them, because I think that is true godly friendship right there.
Yeah. And then the prayer, like, right, obviously,
Totally.
and it's so hard. I mean, I don't even know. I want to ask you this question about those who don't have the same, result that you had. And we'll get there because I think that's the challenge in all of this that we have in life of trying to understand these things.
Right.
So you go through these 4 years and then somehow, I mean, going from 95% plus leukemia cells to none, like, how did that happen? How old were you? Take us through that.
Yeah, so it just kind of was 4 years of hospital stays and, months at a time at the hospital, just intense chemo. And, it was one of those situations where, okay, I lived a week. Then they're like, let's see how long he can live, basically, which is crazy to say. I can't even imagine being my parents and just never really knowing if I was going to make it the next day or the next month or the next year. But it was just 4 years of intense chemo treatment. And then, one day they were just like, it's completely gone, it's miraculous almost. And what's crazy about that situation, other than the fact that I was completely cured from cancer, is they said to my parents, although he is cancer free, he's not out of the woods. So there is a very good chance that he's not able to speak like everyone else would. He might not be able to walk. He might not be able to talk. When you go through such intense chemo for so long, the chances of it having serious side effects on your brain, on your body is very high. So to go from that to where I am today, a former college athlete that had the opportunity to play sports at the highest level. It's just only God.
Yeah, I mean, it is only God, because there's so many layers, like the healing itself, right? The fact that it didn't come back. Then you have the fact that you were able to hit all those benchmarks. Like, so as you were going through it, because it started when you were 1 and going through 4 years, that brings you to like 5 years old. Were you hitting benchmarks during the chemo, or were things delayed during that?
Yeah, no, there's definitely benchmarks, right? And they're tracking it along the way. So you could see that it's like going from 95% to getting less and less, but the chances of it still going to 0 were very slim. Although it was decreasing, it was almost like just managing the symptoms rather than actually fixing the issue is what they thought they were doing. Little did they know that it was actually going to completely cure me of it.
So what's your earliest memory of understanding like what was going on, or understanding what you went through even?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, because it's like, how do you separate what your parents have told you versus like your actual memories? But I think one of my earliest memories is the day that I was cured from cancer officially. And I remember just like getting home, and pretty much everyone we had ever met, like our prayer community, everyone was there and just threw me this giant party. And that is a day that I remember so vividly, even though I was so young, of just like, this is almost what heaven would feel like, of just coming around each other and celebrating that we've made it through this trial together. So, it's definitely a blessing that my earliest memory from that whole situation is the day that I was officially cured. So,
Instead of the other stuff that you could have been remembering that, clearly was not pleasant or easy.
Totally.
So like, okay, so obviously you're healed. Did you have at that point or at any point fear yourself of reoccurrence, fear that this would come back?
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that will always be in the back of my mind, and is for any cancer survivors. I think it definitely decreases the older you get, right? And the longer it's been since you've had it. But I think when I was young and growing up, it definitely was a major fear and anxiety inducing thing of like, this could come back at any time, right? And just because I've had it doesn't mean that I'm out of the woods and that it won't come back. So it was definitely tough navigating that being so young. And another tough piece of it too, and I know you touched on this earlier, of there are so many kids who went through what I went through but didn't have my end result, So meeting people, telling them my story, or them hearing my story and saying, oh, well, my son had leukemia and didn't make it. And it's kind of like, that's a lot for a elementary school kid to process, saying kind of like, well, why did I make it and these other kids didn't? What makes me so special? So I think it's so interesting navigating all of that from such a young age of like, okay, the Lord saved me for a reason. Let's think about this through the positive lens, not through the lens of like, there's so much pressure and anxiety on me because he did save me.
Yeah. Although that struggle's there, right? Like I can't imagine it's not. And like, I don't know, there's always a level, and I can't speak for you, but so feel free to correct me if not, but of, survivor's guilt to some level, right? Of like you were saying, like, why me, not them? And then what do you do with that? Like how has that shaped who you are in some ways, what you do, why you do what you do?
Yeah. I think one of my biggest positive traits, but also obstacles in my faith, is my achievement-oriented nature. So I think I am a very driven, very ambitious person that is motivated through achieving things and accomplishing things. And I think that started because of this whole journey, right? You're being told from a young age, like, the Lord saved you for a reason. And people still tell me that to this day. And so in your mind, you're like, okay, because he saved me, I need to make sure that my life is worthwhile and that it really lives up to what people are expecting of me. And so I'm just going to keep achieving and I'm going to keep accomplishing. I'm going to do the next thing just so people on the outside look at me and say, like, yeah, I can see why the Lord saved him, because he's doing all of these great things. He's accomplishing all of these great things. So I think it kind of has a twofold thing, because it's like, okay, on one hand, it makes me a really great hard worker. It makes me really passionate about what I'm doing. But on the other hand, it's an obstacle to my faith, because it's really easy to make that my idol and make achievements and accomplishments my idol and finding my self-worth there, instead of finding my confidence in the fact that the Lord just created me as I am and he saved me. And it's not because he wants me to accomplish all of these things. I can use my testimony for his glory without, having to kill myself to accomplish all these things.
Yeah. Well, I'm the king of struggling with that too. So I think a lot of us are. And I think in your case, you have this extra layer that makes it that intensifies that pressure. Do you have to kind of check yourself a lot and be like, okay, are you pretty good at consistently checking that? Or do you have to kind of check in and be like, I need to not be doing that?
Yeah, I think I have to consistently check myself. And, I do have friends that also check me. And I think that's super important of saying like, why am I chasing after this thing? Am I chasing after this thing just because I want to feel good about myself? Or am I chasing after this thing because this thing that I'm going to get is going to allow me to move the kingdom further? And I think that's such a hard question for anyone. But like you said, I have this extra layer of pressure that I've put on myself because of what I went through.
Yeah, no, for sure. And obviously, like you went to college, you mentioned being an athlete, you got an MBA, you are the director of digital marketing at Great American Media, which obviously most people know this company. I used to work at PureFlix, so I know the company well. Now it's Great American PureFlix, that division. But let's kind of pivot into that because you're somebody who has sort of studied marketing. You're an expert in it. You understand it. What are your goals ultimately when it comes not just to the brand, but to this craft that you've been honing?
I think marketing is such an interesting industry to be in as a believer and as a Christian, because I think a lot of people think about marketing as like buying into consumerism and materialism and creating these desires in the hearts of people that aren't biblical. So for a while when I was studying this in college, I knew I was really creative. I knew I liked this stuff, but how do you reconcile doing this as a believer that goes against all of those materialistic and consumeristic things? So in that moment, I kind of decided for myself, I know that there's a way to do this where the product or the service that I'm marketing is benefiting society and moving the kingdom forward. And that's what I love about my role at Great American is I can wake up every day and know that like the social media posts that my team is creating or the ads that we're making, we're really pushing out good into society in a culture of entertainment that is doing the exact opposite. So I do feel like we are a light in the entertainment industry. And it's so cool to be able to use what I'm passionate about and creative about in marketing while also still glorifying the Lord. And so I feel like it's such a unique niche that I'm really grateful to be in.
Yeah, and like everything you went through, and who knows where your journey will go next, right? But like being brought into this place where you get to elevate light and God to other people through what you're doing every day. Because as you were saying, like a lot of jobs don't allow people to do that. I have a job where I can do that, you do, but not everyone does. And you were just talking a little bit there about entertainment and where things stand.
Yeah.
When it comes to Great American, what do you think differentiates, makes it truly unique in that entertainment space?
I think you're never going to have to worry what's going to come across your screen if your kids are playing in the living room while you're watching a movie. And I think that's such a unique thing. And it's so rare these days, right? Like even I'll be watching a movie by myself and be shocked by a scene that I like wasn't expecting or didn't really want. And so to give that comfort to our viewers and our subscribers, I think is huge, and I think that's really what sets us apart. We are known for kind of the typical rom-com Christmas movies, and I think people love those for a reason. But even those, all of ours are going to have faith undertones. The scripts are going to be written on the backbone and the foundation of scripture. So we have those. And then we also kind of have a different side of the business where we are telling these really impactful faith redemption stories that I think just really inspire and uplift people. And they're extremely relatable to journeys that everyone has gone through.
Yeah, no, and I love that. And I think that we've seen, I mean, when you look at the box office every year, I know Movie Guide always puts out a report. It's like all the movies that do the best are the family movies or the movies that, are uplifting. Not that other ones don't, but they're the ones that perform. And so it is interesting, like this thirst that people have for the content that you guys are creating. And I know this from my own history working in that part of the industry. And it's often though tough to connect too, right? Like it's trying to get that content to people, and that's what your job is. What are some of the biggest barriers to kind of reaching the family faith audience?
I think for a long time, faith-based movies were known as very cheesy or not high quality, right? Or B-rated. So I think that is just like a preconceived notion that a lot of people have. Whereas the faith entertainment industry, like as you know, has made incredible strides since it first launched. So I think it's hard to get rid of that internal association that people already have with faith-based movies, expecting them to be lower quality. So I think that's a barrier that we have to convince people of, like, these movies are great theatrical films that are doing really well in the box office and competing against these A-list movies. So it's interesting just because of like where the faith entertainment and film industry started to where it is now, people still think it is where it was 20 years ago.
No, that's a really good point. And, I've spent time on some of the early sets and some of the films I won't mention in the past. And, being there, one thing I do love, like, and I will say this, I think we can be extra harsh on Christian film because of that trajectory. And like with Hollywood not really allowing it in the early days, people had to get creative and iterative and do things outside of the studios and
Absolutely.
scrounge up money from investors, right? And make these movies happen. So now you have Great American and you have other great companies that are actually creating great quality content.
Right.
And so helping people understand that trajectory and how we got to a place that we're in now is super important. Like when you think about the future of the brand, what is your hope?
I would love to see more very well-known celebrities join the brand. I think we have a great family of talent that is really committed to the faith industry, but I think, every day it feels like there's a new A-list celebrity that's speaking out about their faith and leaving California and going to Tennessee or Texas because they don't like what's happening. So I would love to see more of those people not just join Great American, but start to make more faith-based films, because I think society is craving it way more than anyone would ever know. And I think we're seeing that on our side. Angel Studios is seeing that. I think there's so many great companies out there that are chasing after the same mission. And we just need more people on board from the talent perspective. So I would kind of love to see more of that over the next few years.
I love that. Well, okay, I got to ask you another question about your faith, because like kind of going back to our earlier conversation, you obviously went through all this. At what point, your parents were Christians, at what point for you would you say that like you started to own your faith and that the pieces came together of the understanding of your miraculous healing, of what you went through, and of God's role in it? Like, how old were you? What did that process look like?
Yeah, I would definitely say it was around middle school where I really would consider like myself to be a Christian and come to faith on my own. Like you said, I grew up in that kind of world and household, and my parents have both worked in ministry for a long time. So it's only what I've known forever. But I think constantly wrestling with anxiety and not really knowing why through my elementary school age, and then coming to this realization in middle school of like, it's because I'm putting all of this pressure on myself because of what I went through. And the Lord just really speaking to me and saying, you don't have to be a perfectionist on the outside to impact my kingdom. You're going to impact my kingdom so much more by showing your weakness. The verse that says his power is made perfect in our weakness. So really just getting convicted by that of saying like, okay, I need to stop portraying this image on the outside that's caused by internal pressure to make sure that people think I'm living a life worthwhile. My worthwhile life will come from impacting the kingdom. And that's done through being vulnerable and showing my weakness. So in middle school, I would say I really made that shift.
No, I love that. That's incredible. And you're doing amazing things at Great American. And, final question for you, and it's kind of a heavy one, I guess. I mean, maybe you won't think it is, but I think it is. There are a lot of people right now who are probably watching or listening who they're dealing with a diagnosis. They're dealing with a kid, a grandkid, and they're not seeing the healing, right? Your parents went through this for 4 years with you and they're struggling. I mean, what would your advice be to them in the midst of that uncertainty?
Yeah, I think, trust is such a cliche Christian answer, but I think really trusting in the Lord. And, but what does that practically look like? And I think it's living faithfully every day. So I think when we get focused on the macro is that when we get really overwhelmed and frustrated, when we're not seeing the healing or the results from the things we're praying through. But I think if we just focus on the next day and that day living faithfully and honoring the Lord, days turn into weeks, turn into months. And before you know it, you really start to see your trust grow. And so even to this day, I remind myself of like, okay, I'm trusting the Lord by living faithfully when my feet hit the ground this morning. And I'm just going to focus on these 24 hours and what I can do for his kingdom and not worry about anything else beyond that.
I love that. Well, Cam, you're an inspiration. Thanks for sharing your story. Really appreciate it today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Billy.